27 years since your sister died in Paris that night. How alive in your memory is she now?
Very, and in so many people's. I mean, even when I was in makeup just now, somebody came up almost crying, saying how much that she meant to them. And every day people tell me what an inspiration she was, how much they miss her, what they did the day she died. It's extraordinary.
A woman who spent decades fighting for public acceptance, who stood beside Charles through scandal, through silence, through slow forgiveness from a country that once despised her, loses the titles the Queen the moment her husband stops breathing. There is a moment that royal historians describe as the fastest transition in the modern world. No vote. No delay. No warning shot. The instant a king dies, the crown moves. Not the next morning. Not after the funeral. In that exact second. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because most people get this wrong. They imagine ceremony. They imagine slow, dignified transition, weeks of preparation, a nation given time to adjust. That is not how it works. The moment King Charles dies, Prince William becomes king. Automatically. Before the public knows. Before the palace releases a single word. Constitutional experts confirm this outright. The crown does not wait for permission, and it does not wait for grief. Somewhere inside St. James's Palace, a group called the Accession Council will already be gathering. Privy councillors, great officers of state, senior figures pulled from ordinary life into a room that only convenes for exactly this reason. They do not vote on whether William becomes king. They cannot. Their only function is to confirm what has already happened and proclaim it to the country. Think about the strangeness of that. A council with real historical weight, meeting in one of the most storied rooms in Britain, exists purely to formalize something the law already decided the moment a heart stopped beating. Here is my first question for you tonight, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments below. One word is enough. When you picture Camilla in this moment, do you feel sympathy for her, or do you feel it's simply the natural order finally catching up? Just tell me, sympathy or order. Now stay with me, because this is where it gets harder to look away. In that same instant William becomes king, Camilla stops being the queen. Not eventually. Not once decisions are made. Immediately. She becomes something called a Queen Dowager, a title with real legal history, first used by Queen Adelaide back in 1837. There is no ceremony for this loss. No announcement written specifically for her. Her identity simply changes underneath her, in the same breath that gives her stepson a crown. Think about that for a second. A woman who spent decades fighting for public acceptance, who stood beside Charles through scandal, through silence, through slow forgiveness from a country that once despised her, loses the titles the Queen the moment her husband stops breathing. She does not lose her dignity. Experts are clear about that. She keeps her status. She keeps her history. But something else, something colder, starts running the second the title changes. A clock.
I was suddenly told that it was my turn to get up there. And I'd been a broadcaster, so I knew how to speak, I thought. But it was very different to do that on behalf of my sister in front of 1.5 billion people, or whatever it was.
According to constitutional researchers, the money that currently funds Camilla's household, staff, and public life comes from something called the sovereign grant. It is not automatically hers to keep. Under existing rules, that funding is set to expire within 6 months of Charles's death, unless a new legal order specifically renews it. 6 months. That is the real window most people watching this have never heard about. Not a headline. Not a rumor. A documented legal mechanism, sitting quietly in the background of Camilla's future, waiting for someone else to decide what happens next. And that someone is William. Not a court. Not tradition. Not automatic protection. One man's discretion. I need you to understand how unusual that is. Camilla currently holds real, formal status. She is a counsellor of state. She stands in for the monarch when he cannot perform his duties. She is patron or president of more than 90 charities. Decades of public work built one appearance at a time. None of that is guaranteed to survive the transition. Royal historians who have studied this exact scenario say her future role, her funding, even where she is allowed to live, all of it depends on decisions made by William in the days immediately following his father's death. Not written into law. Not protected by precedent. Simply decided. And here is the detail that changes how you should be watching this story. Camilla's relationship with William has been described, by people close to the family, as tense. Not explosively so. Not the kind of thing that makes headlines on its own. But real enough that royal watchers openly question whether the man now holding all the power over her future is someone she can rely on. So ask yourself what happens in that 6-month window.
I remember a very lovely air stewardess looking after me. I was all over the place, just getting through lots of tissues and crying and crying. And then I thought, look, I've got to get a grip here and do something useful for Diana. And I decided the first thing that needed to be done was to find somebody to write and deliver the eulogy. And I had an address book and I went through it and I got to the end. And I thought, well, none of them are right. And then I had this sort of awful feeling that it's going to have to be me.
Ask yourself what a grieving family, thrust into constitutional obligation before they have even had time to process loss, decides to do with a woman whose entire adult life has been built inside a palace she may not be allowed to keep. Because there is one more detail waiting behind all of this. A private house. One Camilla already owns. One friend says she quietly treasures more than any palace she has ever lived in. And when that 6-month clock starts ticking, that house may matter more than anyone in the royal family is prepared to admit. Let's talk about the title itself, because most people assume Queen Dowager is just a formality. A word added quietly to the end of a long royal career. It is not that simple. Here is what almost nobody explains clearly. The title Queen Dowager carries weight, but it carries no power. None. It is history without authority, status without a seat at the table. The last time Britain saw anything like it was Queen Adelaide, widow of King William IV, back in 1837. Nearly 2 centuries ago. That is how rare this moment actually is. Camilla would not be following a well-worn path. She would be stepping into territory the modern monarchy has barely touched. There is a reason it feels unfamiliar. In living memory, the closest comparison most people reach for is Queen Elizabeth, the woman we came to know simply as the Queen Mother. But that comparison, as comforting as it sounds, does not actually apply here, and understanding why matters more than it first appears. You might expect Camilla to become the Queen Mother instead, the title we associate with the late Queen Elizabeth's own mother. Warm. Familiar. Protected by decades of public affection. She cannot use it. Royal historians are direct about why. That title belongs specifically to the mother of the reigning monarch. Camilla is not William's mother. She never will be. So the softer, more beloved version of this role, the one built on decades of goodwill, simply is not available to her. Sit with that for a second. 2 women can hold what looks like a similar position in the royal family, and the public will treat them entirely differently, because one word, mother, changes everything about how history remembers you. The Queen Mother lived for decades after her husband's death, remaining one of the most beloved figures in the country, appearing at public events well into her 90s. But her position was built on something Camilla will never have. A blood relationship to the reigning monarch. Public sentiment softened around her because she was seen, correctly or not, as belonging to the family in the deepest possible sense.
Was found to have been woefully inadequate in its handling of the interview that Martin Bashir did with your late sister, the Princess of Wales at the time. Now you've had some time to reflect on that and think about what happened. How do you feel about that finding?
Actually, Lord Dyson did a very good job. His brief was tiny. It was to look at a very specific area. And there's still so much more to look at in the broader terms of who was responsible for what and how did it come to this.
Camilla belongs to the family by marriage, and by marriage alone. That distinction, small as it sounds on paper, shapes everything about how much protection she is likely to receive once the title changes. Now here is the second layer, and this one is where the real uncertainty begins. Right now, today, while Charles is still king, Camilla holds something called Counsellor of State status. In plain terms, it means that if the king cannot carry out his duties, for illness, for absence, for anything, she is one of the people legally permitted to stand in for him. That is real, formal, written into law under the Regency Act of 1937. Under that same act, the Counsellors of State are defined as the spouse of the sovereign, along with the next 4 people in the line of succession who are over the age of 21. It is a small, specific list rebuilt automatically around whoever sits on the throne. The moment Charles dies, that role changes. It has to. The list of Counsellors of State is built around the monarch's spouse and the next people in line to the throne. Once William becomes king, the entire structure shifts around him and Catherine, not around Camilla. So ask yourself this. What happens to a woman who spent years being formally trusted with a share of the monarchy's authority, the instant that authority no longer includes her? The answer is simple, and it is unsettling. Nothing happens automatically. Nothing protects her by default. That brings us to the charities, because this is the part of Camilla's public life most people actually recognize.
Is William's view very clearly articulated last night, and I was, very surprised when I was listening to that come into our newsroom yesterday evening. But his view very clearly is that his mother would have said different things had she been, had she known the full picture, had she not been deceived.
Not the ceremonies. Not the portraits. The charities. She currently serves as patron or president of more than 90 organizations. Domestic violence support. Literacy programs. Health causes that rarely make headlines but touch thousands of lives quietly, year after year. This is not decoration. This is decades of consistent, unglamorous work. And every single one of those roles exists because the institution allows it to exist. Here is the detail that should genuinely concern anyone who has followed her journey from outsider to accepted royal figure. Once William becomes king, it becomes his decision, entirely his, whether Camilla continues in any of those roles at all. Not a committee. Not a vote. Not protected continuity. One man, recently crowned, freshly grieving his father, deciding whether decades of a woman's public identity continues or quietly disappears. Royal commentators are already split on what he would choose. Some believe he would let her continue much as before, out of respect for his father's wishes and her track record. Others point to something colder, something already whispered about by sources close to the family, a described tension between Camilla and both William and Harry that has never fully gone away, even years into her marriage to Charles. I am not going to pretend to know which version is true. Nobody outside that family truly does. But I want you to notice something about the shape of this story, because it is easy to miss in all the titles and legal language. Every layer we have uncovered so far, the loss of the Queen, the closed door on Queen Mother, the end of her Counsellor of State role, the fate of 90 charities, all of it points toward the same uncomfortable truth. Camilla's future is not secured by any rule. It is secured, if it is secured at all, by a relationship. By whether the people around her choose to protect what she has built or quietly let it fade. And relationships, unlike constitutional law, are not written down anywhere. There is no document guaranteeing kindness. No legal clause protecting loyalty. Just a woman, a title with no power, and a nephew turned king who will decide, privately, what her decades of work were actually worth to him. That uncertainty alone would be enough to sit with tonight. But there is a second, colder mechanism running underneath all of this, one that has nothing to do with relationships or goodwill at all. One built entirely out of numbers, deadlines, and a legal countdown that does not care how anyone feels. That is where we go next, because the real question was never just about her title. It was always about who pays for the life that comes after it. There is a number hiding behind every headline about Camilla's future, and almost nobody says it out loud. 6 months. That is the length of time her current funding is guaranteed to last after Charles dies. Not indefinitely. Not by tradition. 6 months, and then the money that pays for her staff, her household, her public life, simply expires unless someone acts to renew it. Let that sit with you. The mechanism behind this has a name. It is called the sovereign grant, and right now, it exists specifically to support the reigning monarch and his family in their official duties. The moment Charles is gone and William is crowned, the structure underneath the grant does not automatically stretch to cover a Queen Dowager living quietly in the background. According to legal researchers who have studied this exact scenario, continuing her funding would require something called an order in council. A formal, deliberate legal step. Not something that happens by default. Something someone has to choose to do. There are alternatives, on paper. The Duchy of Lancaster, a private estate that has funded parts of the monarchy for centuries, could theoretically be redirected to support her household. So could a new parliamentary arrangement, negotiated specifically for her situation. But every single one of those paths requires the same thing. A choice. Made by someone else. On her behalf. I want you to notice the pattern forming here, because it is the same pattern from every layer of this story. Nothing protects Camilla automatically. Every single piece of her future, her title, her charities, and now her income, depends on a decision made by other people in the earliest, most disorienting days of a national tragedy. Picture it for a moment. A family in mourning. A funeral being planned. A coronation looming somewhere on the horizon. And somewhere inside that chaos, someone has to sit down and decide whether an aging widow's household budget gets renewed. It sounds almost too mundane to be dramatic. But mundane is exactly where real power hides. Nobody needs a public confrontation to quietly let a deadline pass. Nobody needs a scandal. All it takes is silence, paperwork left untouched, decisions deferred during a period when everyone has a reasonable excuse to be distracted. That is the real danger sitting inside this 6-month window. Not cruelty. Not conflict. Just the quiet possibility that nobody prioritizes an old woman's paperwork when a kingdom is busy burying a king and crowning another one. Now let's talk about where she would actually live, because this question matters more than people realize. Camilla currently shares Clarence's house with Charles, a residence that has been her home for years, filled with the ordinary texture of a life built slowly, side by side with her husband. It is not officially guaranteed to remain hers once he is gone. Royal households shift when a reign ends. Space gets reassigned. Priorities change. What happens to Clarence's house, and whether Camilla stays there, depends once again on choices made by the new king and his household, not on any right she automatically holds. But here is the detail I find genuinely moving, buried underneath all this legal uncertainty. Camilla already owns a private home. It's called Ray Mill House, and by every account from people close to her, it is the one place in her entire life that belongs to her completely, with no palace attached to it, no title required to walk through the door. A friend once described it, through the Telegraph, as the place where she can finally take her shoes off. Not metaphorically. Literally. A place where being royal simply stops for a while. I keep thinking about that phrase. Because for a woman whose every public identity, her title, her charities, her formal authority, is currently balanced on decisions someone else gets to make, that one private house might end up being the only piece of her future that nobody can take away. Not William. Not the palace. Not a 6-month clock ticking somewhere inside a government office. Just hers. And maybe that is the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every headline about crowns and titles and constitutional procedure. After decades spent building a public life inside an institution that can reshape her identity in a single instant, the thing Camilla may end up relying on most is not a title at all. It's an address only she has ever truly owned. But even that private sanctuary cannot fully answer the deeper question running underneath this entire story. Because titles can be reassigned. Funding can be renewed or allowed to quietly lapse. houses can remain in her name. None of that tells us what actually happens between the two people who matter most in this equation: Camilla and the man who will hold every one of these decisions in his hands. Let's talk about William. Not the version of him presented in official portraits, smiling beside his father at ceremonial events, playing the dutiful heir for cameras that catch everything and explain nothing. I mean the real relationship. The one people close to the family have quietly described for years. Sources familiar with the family have told entertainment outlets that the relationship between Camilla and William, and separately between Camilla and Harry, has never been entirely comfortable. Not explosive. Not headline-making on its own. Just persistently, quietly tense, in the way that some family relationships simply are, without ever becoming a public scandal. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets exaggerated into something it isn't. Nobody credible is describing hostility. Nobody is describing conflict severe enough to make front pages on its own. What multiple sources describe instead is something more ordinary, and in some ways more unsettling. A coolness. A distance that never fully closed, even after 2 decades of Camilla being part of this family. Now hold that alongside everything else we've uncovered. The title that offers no protection. The charities that continue only at William's discretion. The funding that expires unless someone actively renews it. And now, sitting underneath every one of those decisions, a relationship history that royal watchers openly describe as strained. Ask yourself the question honestly. If you were the one person capable of quietly letting an old title fade, or a set of charity patronages dissolve, or a funding renewal slip past its deadline, and your relationship with that person had never been especially warm to begin with, what would tip the scale? I don't think it would be malice. I think it would be something far more human and far more common. Simple neglect. The quiet, unremarkable failure to prioritize someone else's future when your own life has just been rearranged by grief and a crown. Royal historians who study this exact kind of transition are split on what William will actually choose. Some believe respect for his father's wishes and Camilla's decades of consistent public service will carry real weight. He is, by most accounts, a careful, deliberate man, unlikely to make impulsive decisions about something this sensitive. Others point to that same described tension and ask a harder question. Respect can coexist with distance. A man can honor his father's memory without going out of his way to preserve every part of his father's wife's public life. Neither side knows for certain. Nobody outside that family does. But here is what makes this different from ordinary royal speculation, the kind that fills gossip columns and disappears within a week. This isn't speculation about a scandal that may or may not have happened. This is speculation about a decision that has not been made yet, because it cannot be made yet. It is sitting in the future, fully formed in its mechanics, waiting only for the moment none of us can predict. That is what makes it different. That is what makes it, in its own quiet way, one of the most unsettling parts of the modern monarchy. Not a mystery about the past. A mystery about an inevitable future with a decision-maker we already know, and an outcome none of us can see yet. There is one more piece of this puzzle, and it changes the picture more than people expect. Because Camilla is not the only person whose entire identity shifts the instant William becomes king. Standing right beside her, in the same breath, is a second transformation, quieter in the headlines but just as absolute in the law. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, becomes queen. Not eventually. Not through any ceremony that has to wait for a coronation. The moment William accedes, the title moves to her automatically, the same way the crown moves to him. One title steps backward into history while another steps forward into power, in the same single second. Think about what that means for the dynamic inside this family. For years, Camilla has held the title of Queen. Senior. Established. The king's wife, standing at the center of royal life. And then, without warning, without transition, that exact word belongs to someone else. Someone younger. Someone who has spent years being carefully, deliberately positioned as the future face of the monarchy. Royal historians describe this as one of the most psychologically complicated aspects of succession, and it rarely gets discussed openly. It is not just that Camilla loses a title. It is that the same title, the exact same word, immediately becomes attached to another woman in the family, standing in the same rooms, attending the same events, addressed by the very phrase that used to belong to her. There is no cruelty required for that to feel enormous. It is simply what the mechanics of succession do, whether anyone intends it or not. And this is where every thread we followed tonight finally comes together. A title with no built-in protection. A funding structure with a 6-month expiration. A residence that isn't guaranteed. A relationship with the new king that has been described, consistently, as something short of warm. And now, standing at the center of the family's public life, a new queen who did not have to fight her way into acceptance the way Camilla once did. None of this is a prediction of conflict. I want to be clear about that. Nobody credible is suggesting Catherine and Camilla will struggle publicly, or that William intends anything but respect for his father's marriage. What we actually know, from historians, from legal researchers, from people who have spent years studying exactly this kind of transition, is simpler and in some ways more sobering. Nothing about Camilla's future after Charles is guaranteed by any rule, any tradition, or any law. It is guaranteed, if it ends up being guaranteed at all, by choices. Choices made by a new king in the earliest, most difficult days of his reign, while grieving his father and adjusting to a crown he has waited his entire life to receive. So where does that leave Camilla, tonight, as we close this chapter of her story? Here is what we actually know, stripped of speculation. She keeps her dignity. Every historian agrees on that much. Whatever title she holds after Charles is gone, Queen Dowager, or something quieter still, nobody expects her to simply disappear from public life. Her decades of work, her marriage, her history, none of that gets erased by a change in title. But dignity was never the real question in this story. Security was. And on that front, the honest answer is that nobody knows. Not the historians. Not the royal correspondents. Not even, in all likelihood, Camilla herself. Her future rests on a title with no built-in power, a charity legacy that continues only if William chooses to let it, a funding structure with a 6-month expiration clock, a residence that isn't hers by right, and a family relationship that has been described, consistently, as something short of warm. None of that is destiny. All of it is possibility. Maybe William honors his father's marriage the way many expect him to, quietly ensuring Camilla's public life continues largely unchanged. Maybe the funding gets renewed without drama, the charities continue, and Ray Mill House simply becomes a peaceful retreat rather than a necessary refuge. Or maybe the described distance between them proves to be exactly what it sounds like. A slow, undramatic fading. No public conflict. No scandal. Just decisions quietly deferred, funding quietly lapsed, patronages quietly reassigned, until one day the public simply notices that Camilla isn't appearing the way she used to. We won't know which version becomes real until it actually happens. Nobody can tell you today. What we can tell you is this. Everything explored tonight is documented. Real constitutional mechanics. Real historians. Real, on-record descriptions of a family relationship that has never been simple. And if you have made it this far tonight, I want to hear from you, because this story genuinely divides people. Do you think William protects Camilla's future the way his father would want, or do you think the distance between them becomes impossible to ignore once the crown actually changes hands? Tell me which one you believe, and why, because the comments on this one are always the most honest part of the whole story. There is still one thread we have not pulled all the way through, and it may be the most important one of all. Because everything we discussed tonight assumes a peaceful, uneventful transition. A king who simply decides, quietly, what Camilla's future looks like. But history rarely stays that tidy. Next time, we go inside what actually happens when a royal household disagrees behind closed doors about a decision like this one, using real, documented cases from royal history where funding, Titles and residences became genuine points of tension between a new monarch and the family left behind. What happened to previous royal widows when the new king did not step in to protect them, and what that history quietly predicts about the 6 months waiting for Camilla the moment this all becomes real?